Imagine nations literally born in conflict in what the historian John Charles Chasteen calls blood and fire. That's the stark reality of Latin America's beginnings.
It is. And that phrase from his book, Born in Blood and Fire, really sets the stage. It's a history etched with violence, yes, but also incredible resilience.
Definitely. Today we're diving into that history using Chasteen's work as our guide. And, we're also drawing a bit of inspiration from channels like Mindful Moments on YouTube.
Ah, yes. They do some interesting AI-driven book analyses over there.
Exactly. They encourage that kind of critical thinking about big ideas. While they often cover whole books, we're going to focus on some, let's say, really surprising and significant threads within this vast history.
Sounds good. So what's our mission today, specifically?
Our mission is to uncover some of those maybe less obvious forces that have shaped Latin America and understand why they still matter today.
Okay. Well, Chasteen starts, rightly, by emphasizing that conquest is fundamentally about exploitation. That's the bedrock.
Can't argue with that. But he also shows it's more complex than just military might, doesn't he? The colonial system lasted for centuries. How?
That's where the idea of hegemony comes in. It's about control through consent, or at least acceptance, rather than just brute force all the time.
Like the story of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. That really struck me.
Oh, absolutely. A brilliant mind in 17th century Mexico. She wanted to learn, even apparently suggested, disguising herself as a man to go to university.
Incredible. But she couldn't. Not because soldiers stopped her, but because society, the church, the expectations, they just channeled her choices.
Exactly. The choices were basically marriage or the convent. The dominant social norms, the religious authority, these things shaped her reality. No army needed.
And when she did engage in intellectual debate, she was eventually pressured into silence. That shows the power of that shared understanding, that hegemony.
It does. It's subtle, but incredibly powerful. But at the same time, something else fascinating was happening, what Chasteen calls transculturation.
Ah, right. This isn't just culture being imposed from the top down. It's more of a mixing, a blending.
Precisely. A dynamic process where indigenous, African, and European cultures met, clashed, and created something new, often in unexpected ways.
The book gives some great examples, like enslaved Africans who were forced into Catholicism, but managed to keep aspects of their own religions alive by sort of merging their gods with Catholic saints. Syncretism, right?
Yes, exactly. A really powerful example of resilience and adaptation. Or think about indigenous artists working on churches.
They'd weave in their own symbols, sacred plants, animals, maybe an Andean rainbow tucked into a religious scene.
That's it. Subtle but significant acts of cultural preservation and assertion. And the Virgin of Guadalupe, perhaps the most famous example.
Appearing on a site already sacred to the Aztecs. So it became this potent symbol that resonated with both indigenous and Spanish beliefs, but in different ways.
A perfect illustration of that blending. And you see it in the feel of religion, too. The kind of, more austere Catholicism in some parts versus the much more vibrant, celebratory, African-influenced practices in places like Brazil or the Caribbean.
So this transculturation, it suggests a lot more agency for the colonized people than just victimhood, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows people actively shaping their world, even under immense pressure. And it happened differently in different places.
How so?
Well, in the big cities, close to colonial power centers, European norms might have initially seemed stronger. But out in the countryside,
where indigenous and African populations often vastly outnumbered Europeans.
Right. Their cultures had more space, not just to survive, but to actively influence the mix. Demographics mattered. The reach of colonial institutions was limited.
That makes sense. There's also that strange mechanism, the gracias al sacar, buying whiteness.
Yeah, it's complex. People of lower status, if they gained wealth, could essentially petition the crown and pay a fee to be legally classified as white.
Which seems to suggest the system wasn't totally rigid, that race could be, I guess, negotiated.
To a degree. It shows some fluidity, but it also reinforced the basic idea that whiteness was the ideal, the thing to aspire to. It worked within the logic of the caste system.
Okay, so moving forward then, the independence era. This wasn't just about breaking from Spain and Portugal politically, was it?
Not at all. It was fundamentally about forging new identities. Who are these new nations going to be?
And the leaders, the patriots, they needed to unite really diverse groups of people. Creoles, mestizos, indigenous people, Africans. How did they do that?
A key strategy was nativism. emphasizing a shared identity as Americanos, people born in the Americas, united against the peninsulars, the Europeans.
Creating a common enemy. But you pointed out earlier, sometimes the lines were blurry, like Hidalgo in Mexico.
Exactly. He was a Creole priest, socially closer to the peninsulars in some ways, yet he rallied indigenous and mestizo people with this powerful anti-Spanish rhetoric. It was effective, even if it simplified complex realities.
So these independence movements, they looked quite different across the continent.
Very different. You had elite-led movements, like in Caracas or Buenos Aires, a sort of revolution from above.
Okay.
Then you had massive popular uprisings, like Hidalgo's and later Morelos's in Mexico, really driven by the grievances of the masses.
And Brazil was unique again.
Yes, a much smoother, negotiated transition, with Prince Pedro basically declaring independence himself. Less bloodshed, initially at least.
It's fascinating how after independence, many new nations embraced liberalism, constitutions, individual rights, all that. But it didn't quite take root like in Europe or the U.S. Why not?
Well, the social reality was just so different. You had these deeply entrenched hierarchies, vast inequalities, and economies not really set up for that kind of system. The context wasn't there.
And this created space for the caudillos, the strongmen.
Precisely. Powerful regional leaders, often military figures, who commanded personal loyalty. They filled the power vacuum left by the colonial state. Things Rosas in Argentina, for instance.
Right. Often seen as authoritarian, relying on patronage. But you mentioned Carrera in Central America doing something surprising.
Yeah, Carrera, despite being a conservative caudillo, actually protected indigenous communal lands to some extent. So their impact wasn't always monolithic. It could be quite complex, even contradictory.
And around the mid-1800s, this idea of the Americano identity started linking up more with the countryside, with folk culture.
It did. Folk dances, music, rural traditions, things that might have been looked down upon before started getting embraced as symbols of the true national spirit. Another wave of transculturation, really.
It's interesting how culture reflects these shifts. Platforms like Mindful Moments and, well, our own analyses here often explore that very connection, how culture and national identity shape each other.
Absolutely. It's a constant theme. Which brings us to the next major phase, neocolonialism.
Okay, so late 19th, early 20th century. Independence achieved, but now a new kind of dependence emerges. Economic dependence.
Exactly. Latin American economies became heavily geared towards exporting raw materials, coffee, sugar, minerals, rubber, mainly to Europe and the U.S. The export boom.
Good for landowners, maybe the growing middle class in the cities.
Definitely. They benefited from the influx of foreign capital and trade. But for the rural poor, the campesinos, indigenous communities, it was often disastrous.
How so?
Loss of land, again. Communal lands were often privatized for large-scale export agriculture. Working conditions could be terrible. So progress, as the elites called it, came at a huge cost for many.
Yet, even in this tough period, the book mentions individuals who broke through barriers. You mentioned Machado de Assis.
Yes, in Brazil, a man of mixed African descent who became arguably Brazil's greatest novelist. And Rubén Darío in Nicaragua, a literary giant across the Spanish-speaking world.
It speaks to that sort of unique respect for art and literature in Latin America, maybe, providing a pathway that wasn't always available elsewhere.
I think that's fair to say. Talent could sometimes transcend racial and social lines in the cultural sphere. But politically, these neocolonial governments were often quite authoritarian, weren't they?
Yeah, progress often came with order and control. Managed elections, limited democracy.
Very much so. Stability for investors was key. But beneath the surface, resistance was brewing. Early stirrings of a new kind of nationalism.
People like José Martí in Cuba, warning against U.S. influence even back then.
Martí, Darío himself. Figures who began to articulate a critique of foreign dominance and assert a distinct Latin American identity.
Which then explodes in the early 20th century, right? Nationalism becomes a major force reacting against neocolonialism.
Absolutely. And the prime example has to be the Mexican Revolution.
A decade of upheaval, Madero, Zapata, Villa, leading to the Constitution of 1917. What was so significant about that Constitution?
It was radically nationalist for its time. It asserted national ownership of subsoil resources, oil, minerals. It called for land reform, protected labor rights, and put limits on foreign ownership and the church's power. A real declaration of economic sovereignty.
And this revolutionary nationalism wasn't just political, it spilled into art, too.
Massively. Think of Diego Rivera's murals, Frida Kahlo's paintings. They were creating a visual language for this New Mexico, celebrating indigenous roots, critiquing the old order, art as a political statement.
Were there similar movements elsewhere?
Yes, different forms, but similar impulses. Aya de la Torre in Peru with his APRA party talked about Indo-America, emphasizing indigenous heritage and fighting what he called economic imperialism. The idea of indigenismo gained traction, valuing indigenous culture, at least rhetorically.
And then came populism in the 30s and 40s, another face of nationalism.
You could say that. Leaders like Getulio Vargas in Brazil, or Juan and Evita Perón in Argentina, they mobilized the urban working class, promoted national industry, often with authoritarian undertones, but promised social justice. It's a complex phenomenon, populism.
Very complex. So moving past World War II, things shift again, especially with the U.S.
Yes, there was hope in Latin America for something like the Marshall Plan, but it didn't materialize. Instead, the Cold War arrived.
And Latin America becomes a battleground between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The U.S. focused on anti-communism, often supporting dictatorships if they were aligned against the Soviets. This fueled a lot of anti-American sentiment.
And many nationalists who were already critical of U.S. economic influence started seeing things through a Marxist lens.
It provided a powerful framework for understanding imperialism and inequality. It wasn't that everyone became a doctrinaire communist, but Marxist ideas about dependency and revolution became very influential,
leading to movements like the Cuban Revolution, Castro, Che Guevara, figures who became global icons of resistance.
Absolutely. Cuba became a potent symbol, inspiring revolutionary movements across the continent and prompting a strong, often interventionist reaction from the U.S.
Then we skip ahead a bit past the dictatorships and debt crises of the later Cold War to the era of neoliberalism, free markets, privatization.
Right, the dominant ideology from roughly the late 80s into the early 2000s. It brought some growth initially, tamed hyperinflation in places, but it also often increased inequality and led to disillusionment.
Which then led to the pink tide, or the new left turn.
Exactly. Around the early 2000s, voters across Latin America elected leaders who rejected strict neoliberalism, figures like Lula in Brazil, Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia.
But they weren't all the same, were they? A pretty diverse group.
Very diverse. Some, like Lula, sought to harness market forces for social goals, focusing on poverty reduction. Others, like Chavez, took a much more state-centric anti-U.S. approach. But the common thread was a renewed focus on national goals and helping the vulnerable.
And alongside this, there's been a shift in how race and ethnicity are discussed, moving away from just emphasizing mestizaje, or mixing.
Yes, a growing embrace of multiculturalism, officially recognizing distinct indigenous and Afro-descendant populations and their rights, though the legacy of mestizaje as a national ideal is still powerful and complex.
So, bringing us to today, Latin America is still facing huge challenges, environmental issues like the Amazon rainforest, obviously.
Huge. And increasing interconnection, especially with the U.S., through migration, creating new cultural and political dynamics.
It really underscores Chasteen's point that this is not a static history. It's constantly evolving, definitely not your father's version of Latin America.
Not at all. It's incredibly dynamic.
When you look back at this whole sweep of history, conquest, blending, independence, neocolonialism, nationalism, revolution, neoliberalism, the left turn, what's a key takeaway for understanding the world now?
I think it's that constant tension, that interplay between external pressures and internal responses, how global forces shape local realities, but also how people locally adapt, resist, and create their own paths. And the ongoing struggle for social justice and true sovereignty, those themes resonate far beyond Latin America, don't they?
They really do. It's a history full of lessons about power, culture, and identity that feel incredibly relevant everywhere.
Absolutely.
Well, if this conversation has piqued your interest, definitely subscribe so you don't miss our future analyses.
And share this with friends or colleagues who might find this history fascinating.
For sure. And if you want to go deeper, we really recommend picking up John Charles Chasteen's Born in Blood and Fire. We'll put a link where you can find it in the description.
It's a very readable and insightful overview.
Most importantly, though, keep thinking critically. Keep questioning the forces, historical and present, that shape our world. Thanks for tuning in.